Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was critical of the Roman government and its buildings, and it was reported to the authorities, and he and his son, Rabbi Eleazar, were sentenced to death. They hid in a cave for 12 years, studying Torah day and night, and nourished by a carob tree and a spring of water that miraculously appeared inside the cave. And to preserve their clothes, they wore them only for their daily prayers, and the rest of the time they buried themselves in sand up to their necks as they immersed themselves in intense study. After 12 years of isolation in that cave, the Roman emperor died, and the death sentence was lifted. Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, came to the entrance of the cave and said, who is going to tell Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Eleazar that they can come out of the cave and that the decree has been lifted? And they emerged. After 12 years, they emerged from the cave. And what did they see? They saw ordinary people who were plowing and sowing. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, "What? These people abandon the eternal life of the Torah and engage in temporal life for their own sustenance?" And every single place that Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Eleazar directed their eyes immediately burst into flames. A bat kol, a divine voice, came forth and said to them, "What? Did you emerge from your isolation in the cave in order to destroy my world? Get back inside. Return to your cave." They went back and sat in the cave for another 12 months until a divine voice said to them, "Emerge, emerge from your cave." They came back into the world, and everywhere that Rabbi Shimon's son, Rabbi Eleazar, struck with his eyes, his father, Rabbi Shimon, would heal. Rabbi Shimon said to his son, Rabbi Eleazar, "Bani, my son, you and I suffice for the entire world as the two of us are engaged in the proper study of Torah." Rabbi Shimon's enigmatic, cryptic comment at the end perhaps implies that we need both. We need the fire and we need the water, the din and the rachamim, the harsh judgment and the sweet mercy. We need balance. We need integration. I don't know. What I do know is that there's not a single one of us here who could have predicted or imagined the impact of the last year and a half, the impact that it's had on us as individuals, as a community. Can we even begin, really, to contemplate the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical toll that it's had on us all? I think all of us. Yes, we have experienced being in caves of isolation, to emerge and perhaps to go back and perhaps to emerge again. This rabbinic father and son didn't have Zoom to keep them connected to their community. They didn't have the CDC, they didn't have medical directives or whatever media they were tuning into. They had Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, and a bat kol, a heavenly voice that was directing them. In June, the New Yorker published an article that was called The Age of Reopening Anxiety. You ready for this? It was by a journalist called Anna Russell. And she says like this, she says, all that trial and error crashing around is enough to make you want to stay inside, where the codes are known. Inside, she says, you are the code. Inside, you are the code. Recently, she said, I spoke with Arthur Bregman, a psychiatrist in Coral Gables, Florida, who has been using a new phrase to describe our desire to stay at home. Cave syndrome. Yep, cave syndrome. Bregman, that's the psychiatrist, has been seeing patients for more than 40 years. And as COVID vaccinations have become more commonplace, he has noticed a reluctance to venture out again among his patients, even the ones who are fully immunized. People can't shake off the anxiety, he's told me. They feel fearful and insecure about the uncertainty of the situation, so they're very kind of timid and uneasy. Anyone relate to that? Anyone feeling a little timid and uneasy being here, being in person, being outside, being among people? You know, sometimes when I need to leave my sweet dog, Baruch, who's going to be 3 in a couple of days, when I need to leave him alone for a long time, I sometimes put him into his crate with a peanut butter-filled Kong toy. And very often, when I come back home and I open the door to let him out, guess what? He doesn't move. He stays there. He feels safe. Cave syndrome? Maybe. So now that most of us, though definitely not all of us, have stepped out from our caves, how are we emerging back into the world? Are we looking at one another with love and kindness and positivity, generosity? Or are we burning up the world with our fear and our suspicion and our judgment? Have we learned a sweet and generous Torah of wisdom in the cave that deepens our sense of connection to each other and to all beings? Or have we become more entrenched in our own beliefs and our own positions in the world? As a colleague of mine who actually also grew up in London, seems like a thing for rabbis in America, I don't know. Rabbi Danny Berkman, he wrote a recent article in E-Jewish Philanthropy, and he put it like this. He said, like Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar, we may not emerge from isolation in the right way at the first time of asking, but hopefully, we can learn the lessons from their example. If we are disdainful of each other, filled with judgment and contempt, we will find ourselves back in quarantine pretty quickly. When we recognize our interconnectedness, when we talk to each other, and when we care for one another, only then can we truly emerge back into life. But this is not just about COVID-19, of course. It's about a collective sense, I think, of trauma that has surely, in ways that we cannot even begin to fully understand, impacted all of us. We simply have not had time, nor the skills, to process all of the different traumas that we've faced. It's kind of like a reverse and cruel version of Dayenu. Wouldn't it have been enough to have had a deadly pandemic? No. We also had a terrifying insurrection on January 6th at our capital. Our beloved city of Boulder experienced a brutal mass shooting in King Soopers in March. And as that trial begins slowly, that's going to reactivate trauma for so many of us. The continuing racial inequality, the rising anti-Semitism, Dayenu. Our skies and our eyes were full of smoke from devastating wildfires in the west. While others were submerged in floodwaters, we've seen howling, horrific, devastating hurricanes, another catastrophic earthquake in Haiti, and all of this against the backdrop of the most alarming IPCC 2021 report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And of course, we have the new frightening and deadly reality in Afghanistan. Dayenu! Wouldn't any one of those have been enough? Enough already. Has any of us really processed any one of these? I haven't. Our whole culture, I think, is in a state of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I heard about a rabbinic colleague, who just a few days before Rosh Hashanah had a breakdown and disappeared for a few days. Haven't we all felt a bit like that on certain days? So many of us need mental and emotional support, and we have an offering of that coming up soon, facilitated by Rabbi Rosalie Ozian and Sarah Shachtman. I hope you will consider joining Re'im, Friendship Circle, for mental and spiritual and emotional well-being. You know, trauma can express itself in many different ways, and most of us, I don't think, and I know this is true for myself, are not even aware how it operates. But many researchers have studied how it sticks around in our systems. I was in an interfaith clergy meeting a few months ago with Together Colorado, and a Christian colleague of mine made the comment that the most important role right now for us clergy is to be a non-anxious presence. When I heard that, I immediately balked and thought, oh my goodness, there are way too many times that my presence has been anything but non-anxious, and just perhaps added more anxiety than calm, and I'm really sorry for that. Any of you who've been impacted by that anxiety that I have been feeling along with so many of us. Professor Bessel A. van der Kolk is a professor out of Boston University, and he has a best-selling book called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's been selling a lot recently. And the subtitle is Memory and the Evolving Psychobiology of Post-Traumatic Stress. I'm going to confess, seeing as this is the season of confession, that I haven't actually read the book. But I did listen to a podcast interview with the author on Ezra Klein's podcast. Thank you, Robin, for pointing that to me. And I mean, listening to a podcast with the author is almost as good as reading the book, isn't it? Anyway, van der Kolk says this. He says, ever since people's responses to overwhelming experiences have been systematically explored, researchers have noted that a trauma is stored in somatic memory and expressed as changes in the biological stress response. Intense emotions at the time of the trauma initiate the long-term conditional responses to reminders of the event, which are associated both with chronic alterations in the physiological stress response and with the amnesias and hypoamnesias characteristic of post-traumatic stress disorder. He goes on, the inability of people with PTSD to integrate traumatic experiences, and their tendency instead to continuously, listen to this, continuously relive the past are mirrored physiologically and hormonally in the misinterpretation of innocuous stimuli as potential threats. The misinterpretation of innocuous stimuli as potential threats. That's a very scientific way of saying that it is absolutely impossible to predict how we're going to behave when something reactivates a traumatic memory. I feel sure that the horrific culture wars that are being waged in this country and throughout the world come from trauma, from fear, from the anxiety of just not feeling safe. The horrific ways in which we have simply lost the ability to listen to each other, to speak to each other kindly when we don't agree, entrenched in our own narratives, in our own way of seeing the world, and with the destructive potential, like Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Eliezer, to set fire to anybody who has an opposing view to us. Last November 2020, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks passed away. And some of you know that I've been almost every Shabbat quoting something from his teachings. And earlier in that same year, last year in 2020, one of his last books was published, a book called simply Morality. And there's a chapter 13, which is called Two Ways of Arguing. And he opens the chapter by quoting a 2019 speech by former President Barack Obama, who says this: "The idea of purity," says Obama, "and that you've never compromised and you're always politically woke, you should get over that quickly. The world is messy. There are ambiguities. People who do really good stuff have flaws. People who you are fighting may love their kids and share certain things with you." Rabbi Sacks continues, "In other words, social and political issues are complex and multifaceted. Not every issue is a clash between right and wrong. Sometimes it is between right and right, between two strong but incompatible ideas." We got a painful taste of this recently in our community, as an attempt to let a voice be heard backfired terribly, and I and others were the recipients of some very strongly and not always kindly stated opinions. In a few minutes, I am going to be leading Rosh Hashanah Musaf for the first time in my life. And I have so many mixed emotions about that, including some very, very deep sadness and, of course, plenty of trepidation and just a little bit of anger. Even if we collectively, which I think we did, made the right decision for our community, it's less about science and safety. Rather, it's about sanity and civility. There are some very strong feelings on both sides, and it's not about the outcome, but really about the process, which was a little bit flawed. Like most of us, by the way, I was very eagerly awaiting the vaccines, and I was one of the first people, actually, thanks to Rosalie, in my age group to get vaccinated. And I've publicly been promoting and encouraging all of us to get it. But, and this is an important but, I will listen to and I will remain in community with those who are not vaccinated, and I will hear their arguments. I don't want to get into any specifics about natural immunity or long-term effects of antibodies or of the effectiveness of the vaccine, and I personally have no doubt at all that our life has changed significantly. We would not all be here if it wasn't for the vaccine. That's kind of obvious, I think, to most of us. It's also allowed me and many others to see family and friends for the first time in a really long time. So many advantages, but please, I beg us as a community, let's not force those who are not vaccinated into a whole new level of social isolation as outcasts and pariahs. Let's retain enough humility and humanity to acknowledge that there is still so very, very much that we just don't know. And to enter this new year, whether we are still in our caves or out in the world, with kindness and with generosity. No one's walked out yet? Okay, good. Rosh Hashanah, also known as Yom Hadin, Judgment Day, is in part about our fervent prayers and our hopes that God's mercy and compassion will outweigh the harsh decrees of justice. Recognizing all of the intense trauma that we have been experiencing, let's enter into a new year with compassion. Compassion for ourselves, compassion for each other. Just knowing that we are all so imperfect and that we have been so afraid. Way too much in our society has become highly politicized. And at what cost? Rabbi Jonathan Sacks continues in that chapter that I quoted from in his book Morality to talk about the biblical figure of Korach, who challenged the leadership of Moshe and Aaron, of Moses and Aaron. And Rabbi Sacks characterizes Korach as the first political populist. And Rabbi Sacks says, what links populism on the one hand and the phenomenon of wokeness on the other is that they are both binary. They are both extreme. Both divide the world into good and evil, black and white, and no shades of gray. Both see themselves as oppressed and their opponents as the oppressors. They see no saving grace on the other side. As I age, and I am aging, I thought I wasn't a while ago, but I realize I am. It is my 18th Rosh Hashanah here, after all. As I age, I find myself becoming more centrist, which is weird for me. But not centrist as a political ideology, but as a profoundly Jewish and spiritual principle of striving for balance and nuance rather than a need to be right in a world that feels increasingly perplexing and uncertain. As a result, I have been criticized both for being too conservative and for being too progressive, too woke and not woke enough, with quite painful consequences on both sides. We cannot cancel each other out when we don't agree with each other. Too many relationships have been broken and reputations lost. I absolutely do not deny science, yet I am not sure that science is always about certainty and answers. But sometimes, like religion and like art, it's actually about asking questions, about asking the right questions. A doctor friend of mine told me that in patient care, doctors teach their students and trainees that medicine is, quote, as much art as science. We are a mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of priests, not immunologists, not politicians, not even activists, but rather a community of priests who are rodfei shalom, builders and pursuers of peace, not of those who shun and excommunicate dissenters, but those who find room in the tent or on the patio or on the grass or inside this building for everyone, or online. Now, of course, we have a deep obligation to be safe and to keep others safe and healthy, but we need to be a little cautious and sensitive about how we do that. Our community is engaged, as I referenced earlier on, in the deeply exciting and energizing project of imagining a new building on this very campus. The creative process with Feingold Alexander Architects out of Boston, which was generously funded to help us in this concept design process, this concept design phase which we're in now, has opened up the essential questions of health, safety, and security, but also deep questions about sustainability, deep connection to the outdoors and to the land that we're on, the transitions from secular to sacred spaces, from outdoor to indoor space, spaces that provide social, intellectual, and spiritual expressions in many, many forms. So the most important question in this process is not what the building's going to be looking like, but who are we going to be inside that building? What are the values that we most want reflected that would allow us to thrive in a new home? There are, of course, many ways we could each answer that question, but it seems to me that respect and dignity for the multiple human faces who enter and who seek safety, connection, refuge, is at the heart of all of it. In that podcast that I referenced earlier with Bessel A. van der Volk on that book, The Body Keeps the Score, he talks very powerfully about the tools that help with the body's reaction to trauma, including therapies like EMDR and MDMA, but he also talks about dancing, about yoga, about singing, about praying, about meditating together. These are all modalities that transcend the pain and anxiety of separation and the differences, and that we can all engage in during these holidays, whether we're inside, outside, or at home. The famous cave story from the Talmud, with which I opened, which is from Shabbat 33b, if you want the reference, concludes with the father and son, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar, seeing a man carrying 2 bundles of fragrant myrtle right before Shabbat. Rabbi Elazar, the son, asks him, why 2 bundles? Wouldn't one be enough? The man explains, 1 for Zachor, for remembering Shabbat, and 1 for Shamor, for keeping Shabbat. Oh, Rabbi Shimon was so comforted by this response that he said, listen to this, he said, see how precious are the mitzvot to the Jewish people. The power that we have of rituals and liturgy of this Rosh Hashanah and these days of awe. The voice of the shofar that we've begun to hear. Beautiful and elevating rituals, mitzvot, inspiring and aromatic and pleasing like those myrtle branches. From behind a mask and with open hearts and open eyes, we emerge from a dark cave, choosing to see with tenderness, with love and possibility, the beauty and the hope, even, or maybe especially, in the knowledge that we just don't know what's going to happen next, and we don't know when we might have to go back inside the cave. Shana Tova.